Order, order. We come to our public proceedings of the Education Select Committee this morning. This morning we'll be taking oral evidence in our major inquiry on the SEND crisis. I'd like to welcome our witnesses this morning and members of the Education Select Committee. We are also joined by guests from the Public Accounts Committee, from the Treasury Select Committee and from the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, such as the interest in this very important inquiry that we are undertaking today. I'd like to ask our witnesses to introduce yourselves briefly to us this morning for the record. Please, I'll start with Phil Haslett.
Thank you for having me. Phil Haslett. I am Deputy Chair of the F40 Group and Assistant Director of Education in Gloucestershire County Council.
My name is Sibieta. I'm a Research Fellow at the Institute of Fiscal Studies and I lead IFS's work on education spending.
Good morning, I'm Claire Dorer. I'm the CEO of NAS, which is National Association of Special Schools. We represent over 450 special schools in the non-local authority maintained sector.
Good morning, I'm Rob Williams. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the National Association of Head Teachers. We represent 38,000 active school leaders across England and Wales, Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Kate Foale. I'm a councillor in Nottinghamshire and I'm also the SEND spokesperson for SEND.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin our questioning this morning, and I'm going to begin with a question to Phil Haslett, on which other members of the committee, other witnesses may wish to come in. But Mr. Haslett, I'd like to ask you how the current allocation and distribution of schools block funding, including the notional £6,000 per child for SEND support costs, is being spent in schools, and how could it be improved?
So I think with schools block, there's a couple of kind of core issues to understand. The way in which the national funding formula works for schools, we would argue is slightly flawed at the moment, and that drives an inequity in funding across the country. So there's a real challenge around equity of funding and the way in which the funding formula works. And I'll briefly explain the funding formula element because I think it's relevant to a range of different things in this space. At the moment, the way school funding's working, the national funding formula is intended to work, is schools get a base funding of funding for the school, they then get per pupil funding, and then there are a range of proxy factors that recognise the complexity of the cohort. So those cover free school meals over 6, low prior attainment, a range of different proxy factors that are there to identify the complexity of the cohort. That includes deprivation factors as well. And then a minimum per pupil funding level is applied. And that minimum per pupil funding level above those proxy factors means that we lose the benefits of it for many schools. So we will see schools building up that funding to a point where they can be £4 or £5 away from the minimum per pupil funding level and get uplifted to it. And because they're not receiving lots of additional funding through the proxy factors, you'll have schools that are £200 or £300 away from the minimum per pupil funding level and getting uplifted to the same amount. So in effect, we've got a formula that is intended to provide, through those proxy factors, additional funding into mainstream schools to better reflect the complexity, SEN, deprivation of their cohort. And for many schools, they're not seeing it. I think in terms of the overall schools block funding, it is driven by a lot of historic factors, and what we've got is quite a few local areas where schools have historically been funded significantly above the minimum per pupil funding level, and the funding formula is intended, I think, over time to close that gap. So the local authorities who are kind of have historically been more poorly funded are closing the gap towards that minimum per pupil funding level. The authorities above it's intended to close. The reality at the moment is every time we put funding into the system, everybody's getting something. So minimum funding levels are going up, minimum funding guarantee, which is also in the formula. So every school gets something. So the schools and the authorities with the most funding are still moving up a little bit, and the ones with the least funding are closing the gap more slowly than they should, and that locks in this kind of historic issue around funding. I think the inequity bit is the point where we start in the space, that if we're not getting the funding to children and young people that we're expecting to through the national funding formula itself, and that within those local areas there isn't an equity of funding, we're not funding the system in the way that it was intended in those formulas. It either at this point requires a significant injection of funding to close that gap, or it needs some tough decisions to say that actually there are some parts of the system that need to either freeze funding for a period of time, or we're actually bringing them much closer. But to put that in context, the variation between some schools is £5,000 per pupil. That's the kind of most significant variation that was in our response. That is too broad a gap, and we recognise, based on demographics, etc., that there would be some variation in funding based on context, area cost adjustments, etc. Totally appreciate that, but actually there is too much of a variation, and that at the moment, those flaws in the way the formulas are working are affecting schools in the round, but actually specifically in the SEND space as well. I think just specifically on the notional formula, there's still national variation in that. It's a local decision what a notional formula looks like. There's a basis for it based on per pupil funding, deprivation and low prior attainment. You can make a decision locally how that works. The reality is it doesn't change the amount of money a school gets. So all it's doing is moving a piece of the pie around the school. And school funding is very tight. This 25-26 allocation, we're seeing kind of 0.5% increase in funding. So we're going into another year probably where most schools are making some kind of adjustments, cuts to start moving funding around. The notional formula doesn't really carry too many legs at the moment, if I'm honest.
So we've got a SEND system at the moment that starts with the expectation of parents, because it's what is written down, it's what is policy in every area, that a school will when a child is identified as having additional needs, a school will identify £6,000 that will be spent to meet the needs of that child. Are you essentially saying that system is completely broken, and that the notional accounting doesn't work, that there isn't transparency about it, and schools are anyway so stretched that money gets eaten up with other needs?
Yes, in essence, I think. I mean, the £6,000 is a figure that hasn't moved for a long period of time, so it kind of doesn't carry a lot of weight because it's not been indexed, it's not inflationary. So, and I think from a school perspective, and the way we work with them, it doesn't necessarily work like that anyway. I think the schools are looking at what their universal targeted offer for SEN looks like, how they maximise that offer for all children with any additional needs. The 6,000 for those with an education, health and care plan is there, and they will obviously ring fence that and be clear about how they're using it. I think as we've seen demand rise in the system, and we have seen obviously significant rise in the demand of for education, health and care plans, it is really increasingly challenging for schools to be able to identify £6,000 per child on that basis, and they then looking at the cohort and what their provision looks like for all children rather than specifically around that 6K.
Thank you. Luke, Sibieta, do you want to come in on this and perhaps respond to what Haslett said?
Sure, of course. So I think there are kind of two key features of the current system, and they kind of made sense when they were introduced, but are now basically arbitrary and contributing to the problem. And the first is the £6,000 threshold, and the second is the separation between the school's budget and the high needs budget. Both of these features are basically now arbitrary features of the system. The £6,000 threshold, as Phil said, has not been updated with inflation, so it creates now incentives for schools and parents to apply for EHCP so they can get top-up funding so they can actually cover the costs of that. Local authorities apply the 6,000 threshold in really quite arbitrary ways in terms of how they count £6,000, whether it's number of hours or this type of support, that type of support, and it just leads to really arbitrary differences. The separation between the schools block and the high needs block is also actually quite problematic. I've gone back to the consultation when that was introduced in 2013, and it makes perfect sense in terms of keeping things transparent and clear, and it made perfect sense for a system where special educational needs levels were stable. They were stable at 2.8% exactly for 15 years. And that system made perfect sense. It makes absolutely no sense in a system where needs are increasing year on year. So the high needs funding element is largely based on a basic amount per pupil, some top-ups linked to deprivation, but also a large amount linked to historic spends, which is not a good way to allocate funding in any way, shape or form. And the department's always looked to get rid of it, but doesn't get rid of it because it's really hard to get rid of, because it has no good objective factors for allocating high needs funding. And as a result, you're in a system whereby funding is allocated really quite arbitrarily. You're seeing increases in need, and as I said at the start, it kind of contributes to the problem as well, because if you look at the local authorities with the biggest deficits, those are the authorities with the lowest levels of funding per high needs pupil. So the fact that the high needs system can't respond to increases in need, and different increases in need across local authorities, means that you have the system as it is at the present.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Rob Williams, do you want to come?
Yeah, I'm just building on what's been said before, I guess. The notional funding particularly is clearly for specific provision for those with SEN support, and also before you kick in for those with EHC plans. But all the costs associated with the provision you put in place have increased in time, over time, whereas that notional amount has stayed the same. So what schools can put in place before they then have to seek top-up funding has been reduced over that period of time. So that, we think, has been what's been driving the EHC plan numbers particularly. It's one way of securing the provision, or trying to secure the provision on that. And also, just one other thing is within the guidance itself, it talks about that there's currently no national approach to the calculation of the school's notional budget for pupils with SEN through the national funding formula. So there's a risk then that all those things that were mentioned by colleagues on the table here it perpetuates the kind of historical inconsistencies that are already in the system. And from our members' perspective, that doesn't make any sense at all. And arguably from a parent's perspective, it doesn't either. Particularly if they move between schools in two separate different areas, their expectation of what their child might get may look very different if they move to a different school. And that's really difficult to explain in a system that's supposed to be a national SEN system.
Thank you. Councillor Foale, do you want to come in from a local authority perspective?
Yeah, just agree with everything that's been said. I mean, these people understand the technical detail of finances much better than I do, but certainly 6,000 notional goes nowhere when it comes to SEND funding, and as we said, that hasn't increased at all for many, many years. I mean, the other issue as well is, I mean, the ability of local authorities to transfer money between schools and the high needs block is very, very restricted. Sometimes it kind of doesn't work at all. It has to be subject to the approval of the Secretary of State. And certainly in Nottinghamshire, that regularly has to be topped up. Unfortunately, so far, we've had money out of reserves, but that clearly can't go on forever. And I think the other issue as well is that, and I'm not to be kind of judgmental about some schools, but given schools are encouraged to focus on academic achievement as a main performance driver, it's not surprising that many might be reluctant to spend 6,000 on pupils from a cohort, which are less likely to achieve high performance. It's quite brutal in schools now. Budgets are very, very tight, and they can kind of be judged very severely, as we know. I think as well, in terms of ring fencing, certainly in Nottinghamshire, I'm sure it happens elsewhere, although I suppose it's different practice across the country. Certainly in Nottinghamshire, schools are required to give evidence, and very kind of clear evidence, that actually they have spent the 6K on these children. So I think to kind of add more kind of bureaucracy to that, actually, again, it's putting another burden on schools who actually don't necessarily have the levers either to put into action, particularly when it comes to kind of holding academies to account. So I think it's yeah.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask other witnesses as well about ring fencing. So we heard evidence in our last evidence session, arguments in favour of ring fencing of the notional £6,000. Can I ask for your comments on that? Phil Haslett, you're shaking your head.
I just can't see the benefit of ring fencing. You're effectively placing another burden into the system for schools to report on how they're using the funding. That would need to be administered and monitored in some way to have any kind of efficacy. So with the way that the funding systems are working at the moment and where school funding is, it just doesn't feel like there would be any tangible benefit to ring fencing.
But given what we hear about, particularly from parents, about the kind of wide variability in how schools seek to meet the needs of children with additional needs, how would you seek to inject greater transparency and accountability for schools on how they're spending money that parents expect is there and is spent on their children?
So it probably plays to one of the concerns I have with the system and the way it's evolved over the last 10 years, is that we are talking more about the funding that's being provided to meet the children's needs rather than whether their needs are being met in school. And I think from a parent perspective, their focus should exclusively be on what provisions my child getting, are their needs being met, not what funding is associated to that and how they're getting it. If their needs are being met in school, then they shouldn't be worried about the funding. And if they're not being met, they should be holding the school to account through the mechanisms that are there. If it's a local authority maintained school, the governors would be the first port of call. If it's a multi-academy trust, trustees, and then there's the regions groups and local authorities. And if they feel their needs aren't being met, they should be pushing through those routes. I think the narrative that it becomes about funding doesn't help anybody actually in that space. I think this has to be about what the provision that's being provided for those children and young people. Obviously funding's a part of it, but when it all becomes about funding, I think it is the wrong narrative for parents. For me, they need to be thinking about the provision, not the funding itself.
But we have a system that is in crisis. It's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
Why we're doing this inquiry. And one of the things that parents will say again and again and again is that there is no accountability within that system for how needs are being met. And funding is obviously the kind of most direct measure of accountability. Is the resource actually being allocated to meet the needs? But if you're saying schools should have discretion to manage their very tight budgets with responsibility for meeting the needs of the child, I suppose it does beg the question as to how, how is there accountability and how is there transparency for the differing approaches that different schools are currently taking?
I think, so alongside what I've just said, I guess the statutory process is the other part to that accountability system. I mean, there is a really clear, as part of that process, plan laid out that in principle has really clear views from education, health and care about that child's needs, the provision that should be being made for them and how it's being met. That kind of mechanism, there's annual review process, there's a range of different mechanisms within that statutory process to hold to account for. Now, don't get me wrong, the system is under significant pressure. I think everybody recognises that. This significant level of demand means that process can often be delayed and that access to some of those things isn't there in a timely fashion, but they are the right mechanisms to hold to account. There is a clear plan there that should be talking about that child's needs, the expected kind of outcomes for them, and I think that's where we should be focusing on the child's outcomes, not necessarily what funding is there behind it. Now, I understand where this conversation comes from. Obviously, I spend my life around funding, but I think there is a real question in this space about kind of making sure we're really focused on meeting the child's needs, not how much funding is going in to meet the child's needs.
And before I pass to other colleagues to begin further questioning, can I just ask for any final comments from witnesses on that question of the sort of schools block of funding, and specifically whether enough is being done within the kind of mainstream schools block funding around early identification of needs when a child first enters school? Is there at least a kind of degree of accountability within the system for that schools are, as soon as a need becomes evident, schools are deploying resources appropriately to assist the family with getting the support that they're in place that their child needs?
I think I've yet to meet a school leader who doesn't want to intervene early if they identify a child who's got special educational needs and they identify that. One of the issues, I think, is when they turn for specialist support to unpick exactly what's required for that child. The capacity in those services is reduced, and we're part of have been part of a coalition called Send in the Specialists, which has something like 130 different organisations. It's I think chaired by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, and all organisations like that sit within it. They see themselves as part of the solution for inclusion within mainstream settings, as part of this kind of early intervention. It also needs to be borne out. When you talk about holding schools to account, which we would not be against in any way, shape or form, but when we look at some of the funding surveys we've done with our members, what comes out about that is almost all the school leaders. So we did a funding survey last year, over 1,000 respondents. Almost all school leaders, 99% of the respondents, said that the funding the pupils required for SEN support was insufficient. The same number said that for those that have top-up funding for those in the HCP. And the vast majority, if you're talking 85% in relation to health and 88% in relation to social care provision, were offsetting costs in both of those two sectors because they weren't getting it elsewhere. So when you're talking about the ability to meet children and hold to them account, because the children are within the school every single day, of course that's the interface where parents engage, but actually fundamentally there are not the levers or enough teeth with areas like health or social care either to make sure that they are delivering their roles within that inclusion too. So I think that does need to be stressed too. And I think even with the tribunal system, which I'm sure we'll come on to later on, a parent could only take, if they have a concern about the health provision part of it, they can only take that to tribunal if they've already got an issue around the education element. They can't just take it on a health element. So there's not enough teeth within that, I don't think, and I think that does have a knock-on effect then in terms of how schools can be held to account to deliver their part.
Thank you. Claire, Dorer.
I'm sure we're going to talk plenty about the increase in the numbers of children placed in independent schools. Feedback from heads of schools that we work with, huge frustration from school leaders about children coming into school with needs which at the point of placement meant that they did require highly specialist placements, but that feeling that if intervention had been more effective earlier on, that it actually wouldn't have reached that point. So there are huge consequences for not intervening effectively, and I think I would support what others have said, that identifying early is important, but we really don't have the infrastructure, particularly around health and around therapies, to make effective interventions at this point.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on now in the interest of time, so I'd like Caroline to come in with your question.
So you've already referred to it, Phil, but we know there is a disparity in how much funding schools get under the high needs block, depending on the national funding formula. So how can the current allocation and distribution of high needs funding be improved to ensure that it effectively meets the current and the future needs of children and young people with SEND?
I think as Luke alluded to, it's quite hard. It's quite a hard thing to answer. There isn't a very easy model around the distribution of high needs funding. And
if you had a magic wand,
I think the disparity is significant at the moment, and the point about the kind of locked-in inequity, you can compare, so day job Gloucestershire, you compare us to another local authority, Shire authority, similar pupil numbers, similar SEM pupil numbers, £31 million a year difference in funding, and our budget's 96. So you can see that is, if we were funded at their levels, we wouldn't have a deficit. And so that variation in funding in high needs block is massive. So whether we'd be advocating for any dramatic changes to the way in which the formulas are working beyond trying to get those historic factors out, doesn't feel to me like there's a perfect solution. It's using kind of area cost adjustments, deprivation, some of the proxy factors we were talking about earlier are the kind of identifiers of need in a local area, low prior attainment, deprivation, free school meals. Those become part of a kind of a formula for high needs that works if we get past the historic factors. And those historic elements are going to be very, very hard to pull out of the system, because that the local authority I just referenced, who's comparable to us, they're also in deficit. So it's not like they're kind of not they're in a better position either. So I think in terms of the high needs formula at the moment, our kind of key priority is to try and get those those historic factors out, and really the only way to do that is investment, because you've got to bring everybody up. The way the funding system is at the moment, we've been through the Delivering Better Value programme with the DFE, which was a really good experience, great programme, but it didn't provide any potential solutions really to the ongoing high needs financial pressures. We got some mitigations out of it, but long term we're still heading towards that kind of significant deficit. And I think if we don't kind of radically rethink the way in which the high needs block is kind of working, get rid of those kind of locked in formulas. I think the point that Luke was making earlier about the kind of the link between schools block and high needs block, you know, we do need more flexibility as local areas. I think as schools forums, we've got the governance facilities through schools forum to be able to manage these things locally. Given more flexibility between the schools block and the high needs block, there are some potential solutions in there. We're just very restricted right now in what we're able to do with the current funding. So in terms of the actual formula itself, I don't think there are lots of things necessary in it we would significantly advocate for change, apart from losing those historic elements, which are the biggest cause of concern for the poorer funded authorities, as you can appreciate.
Luke, do you have any great
I
ideas?
definitely do.
So I think the way the formula could be changed could be described as both hard and maybe some easy ways as well, which is always attractive. So it's important to recognise, I've probably said this quite a lot, how we got here. So the high needs block funding and the £6,000 came in at a point where we thought the system was really quite stable. At 2.8% of children with special educational needs statements, and not that much variation across local authorities in terms of levels of need. So we had some proxy factors, but we didn't really need to rely on them that much, because in reality local authorities are quite similar. That doesn't apply anymore, because we've seen such rapid increases in measures of need. But on the other hand, the fact that we've seen this really rapid increase in need across all local authorities, to some extent means you can just say, well, the basic level of need across local authorities is already so high. You can allocate quite a large amount through a basic amount and don't need to use these historical factors that were there sort of to iron out some small differences, but they can't be used to iron out big differences. If you're in a world where everyone's seen big increases in need, then the basic amount just needs to be higher for most local authorities.
More money.
Well, more through the basic amount rather than necessarily more money.
Okay, thank you.
You
Thank you, Chair. I had a couple of quick follow-ups on this question, which is very pertinent to me because my local authority, Wokingham, was one of the least well-funded in the high needs block, and the F40 has shown there's a disparity of about 3 times between the lowest and the highest funded. I was wondering, Mr. Williams, from the perspective of school teachers, do you see, what kinds of challenges do you see this in disparity in funding driving between schools, particularly between different local authorities when the level of funding is so different?
It doesn't bring a coherence to a system at all. I think it's difficult if you're in it's particularly interesting talking to school leaders who have moved from one school to another school across a different local authority, and different ways in which those then function, and almost some of the expectations they have of way things were functioning where they were and then don't where they end up. And I think that goes back to the kind of historical things that have been in place for some sort of significant amount of time. We know there are more children with SEN. We know the complexity of needs is becoming more complex. So it's a question of overall quantum as much as how it's distributed.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the basic core budgets are insufficient for our schools. So their basic entitlement, before you're talking about notional funding or indeed high needs, their basic level of funding means, and the level that is not keeping pace with the kind of level of expenditure they need to pay out on in order to provide an education to all the children in their settings. And one of the big concerns that our members talk about as well is the current scale of debt that's sitting in terms of high needs, the deficits that sit within the local authorities. And when they hear welcome additional funding coming from government, the concern is that just gets consumed in the existing debt, and they never see it at school level. And so that's a real concern. And really, I think from a school leader's point of view, it's about making sure that they have. When we look at SEND legislation, we look at the SEND Code of Practice and so forth, it's based upon a premise of a needs-led system. At the moment, what our members tell us, it feels like they're working in a very resource-limited system.
Yeah.
So they have to make decisions about what they can afford rather than actually what they want to provide for their children and young people. And when we do our wellbeing surveys, it's the thing that's keeping our school leaders awake at night. They feel like they're failing to do what their children deserve. That's the sense in schools anyway.
So would you also advocate moving to a needs-based funding system?
It needs to be needs-based, we think, because as Luke explained, we understood why we started where we started, but the change has been quite significant over that period of time, and the quantum is simply not enough. And so however you cut that, it's a little bit like rearranging deck chairs. It's not really going to meet the needs. And we haven't been clear either, more generally, about what inclusion means across the whole of the system, not just for mainstream. And I think we need a better definition around that, so we understand what is what described as ordinarily available provision. What does that look like? Not just in the local areas, but nationally. There should be some basis that is fairly common across the whole country. At the moment, that's not the case.
And Councillor Foale, is there anything you'd want to add to that?
No, just to support what's been said. I mean, anybody who goes into schools these days and asks these kind of questions knows that budgets in schools are actually cut to the bone. And I think, certainly in terms of high-level need, as I said earlier, the money's been well overspent in Nottinghamshire, and again, we've got reserves. Other councils won't be in that position. So something really needs to be done in terms of that. And certainly I'd absolutely support the idea of a needs-led system. That is actually got to be at the core, I think, now of actually how we go about kind of solving this problem.
So my last question on this topic to Dr. Luke is, if we were to move to some form of needs-based funding system, what would that mean for national budgets in different departments, and how would you allocate that if you could choose? I don't know if Mr. Haslett might have a view on this as well.
So I think that the kind of work the department would need to do is to effectively try and find good proxies for levels of need across local authorities. It currently has a few in terms of bad health and levels of disability. It will probably need to collect better data either through linking to the census, linking to other health assessments. So it would be largely a work of trying to find good proxies to measure special needs that are objective, and then working to try and assign value to those factors. And
has there been such an exercise already done? What's the kind of back of the envelope scale of this?
I think only the department could do it, because it would require that level of linked data, and it would require a ministerial level priority in terms of saying we need to link this data and do this work.
So right now there isn't enough data in the public domain for you to make that assessment of how.
No, absolutely not.
Mr. Haslett.
Yeah, I think the DfE have tried to identify the right proxy factors over the years. They've really struggled, I think, in the space to do so. The challenge is to be able to identify those and to make sure they kind of link to the kind of level of demand that's in the system. We're talking a lot about need, but there's also demand in the system as well, and that's something that I think probably as most LAs we're really struggling with. Yes, we're supporting a level of need, but since the previous reforms, we are also seeing a significant element of that need being based on demand from the school system. As schools budgets tighten, they're looking to access additional funding and support through this route. I think there's something about kind of trying to make sure that the high needs block and the schools block are much more closely aligned. And if we're using proxy factors in the national funding formula for schools, then why don't they translate into the high needs block as well? But you know, it is tough. It is a challenging piece of work. The key thing, as I said at the start, I think, is to get the historic factors out first. Those need to come out, and then I think you're in a position to be able to start moving forward with the needs-led element.
Luke, do you have any sense of the magnitude of the uplift needed? Are we talking about the billions, the hundreds of millions?
I think you need to separate out the quantum from the distribution.
Yeah.
The quantum is largely being determined by increases in numbers of EHCPs, and the department has forecast for increases in spending of around 2 to 3 billion between now and 2027. I think that seems like a reasonable forecast. In terms of developing the formula, that's more about shaping the distribution.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Manuela.
Thank you, Chair. So the panel has already discussed how important early intervention is, how crucial in supporting children and young people with CND. Should the high needs block prioritise this to improve the consistency and availability of early years C&D provision? And are there additional areas where I-needs funding should be directed? So I'll start with Phil.
So whether we should be prioritising early years funding within the high needs block?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no part of the high needs block at the moment that's ring-fenced for anything apart from hospital education. I think the way in which the funding comes through provides flexibility to local areas to be able to deliver to meet the needs of their local community. The challenge for everybody right now is that investment in earlier intervention, early years, and that's where everybody wants to be. I don't think anybody would disagree. You could go into any local authority in the country and they would say, we want to prioritise early years, early intervention space. The problem at the moment is that everybody is spending all of their high needs block funding on the statutory process. So before you've even started the financial year, you've spent nearly all of your money supporting the HCP system, the system as it currently is. So making the case for early intervention and investment in early years in that way is really challenging, because you're talking about probably a 4 or 5 year commitment to be able to do that, and in the context of the current deficits, it's really challenging. I think the early years space is one we would advocate significant investment in. I think the recent investments in expanding the early years block and the entitlement is in principle a good step, but the reality is that's very focused on child care, and I think the early years system really does need to focus on high quality early education, and things like the move is part of that kind of shift we've seen in early years provision, that the ratio of staff to children change. That's not going to help in the SEND space. If the number of children to staff shifts, which is what's being advocated at the moment in the earlier space, that's really challenging for SEND. So I would say there is a real need to invest in the earlier sector, but I think it needs to be through the earlier block, and I think it needs to focus on what do we want a really good early education to look like. And not that childcare is not important, and I understand the rationale for the expansion and entitlement around getting people back to work, etc. But we need to make sure we've got a sustainable early years system. And actually, honestly, if there's a part of the education system that's most poorly funded at the moment, it is early years. And they are really struggling, and we're struggling to keep a lot of providers open and sustainable in the current system.
Anyone else?
I think two things. I have to agree with what's been said before about the need for investment there. I think one of the issues you'll see often for earlier settings that are standalones, they're not part of a primary school, for example, is the speed at which additional resource can get into that setting. Often you'll see where additional needs have been identified, by the time the process, if you like, has gone through in order to identify the kind of scale of resource that needs to be put in, that child may have moved on from that setting. It takes that sort of length of time. So there needs to be better ways of getting the services around not just the school. It has to be a connection between all the sort of multi-agencies across health, social care and so forth, as speedily as possible, and being able to then get the resource in place that's required in order to provide that. If there was sufficient resource for earlier settings to be able to do some of that work themselves, or at least initially start that process, it will be helpful, because at the moment it is really tight in early years too. But one of the problems is the speed at which that kind of process can take place when identify or concerns are being picked up, and also picking up and making sure there's better connection between what can be picked up even before children have arrived in earlier settings too. The kind of health information that might be available, making sure that connection is far better and far more joined up would be helpful in making sure that earlier settings can get in place the kind of support that's required as quickly as possible with the requisite resource they require.
I'm going to bring in Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the early intervention has got to be right, hasn't it? I think we all understand that. But of course, as has been said, many SEND conditions are undiagnosed at the point of joining preschool, which is where clearly they could and kind of should be identified. But of course, again, I think as what has already been alluded to, a much higher proportion of settings are in the public, voluntary and independent sector, where we're making accountability kind of more difficult. But I think certainly the County Council network, it strongly supports the government's intention to rebalance the whole children's services system towards a wider model of early help. I think it's really, really important. And this kind of idea of kind of early intervention, early help, early prevention, I think, goes right the way across, in my view, kind of children's services. But we feel it should be particularly focused on most disadvantaged children, which we believe will be by far the best means to better identify, support and prevent the growth of SEND conditions at an early stage. I mean, I think, you know, kind of mentioned Sure Start here. I mean, that was really working, and that was working on these principles, and it really really worked well. But I think you've got to remember as well that local authority presently have had to reduce their early help spending. Again, it's a non-statutory, isn't it? Statutory versus non-statutory. I mean, I don't know quite how you tackle that, whether you make early help statutory, and I don't know how you would do that, but clearly it needs much greater emphasis. It's money well spent. But reductions in councils' budgets have meant cutting non-statutory services, which in children's services quite often the prevention services, which is why, and again, that's why we very much welcome 270 million prevention grant announced, but, you know, we need more money, don't we? That's what it comes down to in the end. This needs more resource, and it needs more investment in our children and our children's life chances.
Luke, and then I'm going to bring in Patrick.
I just wanted to continue the point on whole system support. I think I agree with the need for early identification. I think that's really, really important. But sometimes it's not always about prevention either. It's about getting timely support across the whole system, so that it's more effective and cheaper in the long run. So there will be certain therapies that are helpful in the early years. So speech-to-language communication is an incredibly good example where early intervention can be preventative and really quite effective. There are others where it's just about understanding needs and ensuring they can be supported throughout a child's life. So a good example here is people with autism. So early identification allows for pupils to be well supported early on, and put in place procedures and support that are helpful throughout their school career, rather than be identified at age 9, 10 and then require really quite intensive one-to-one support. But then that's also about providing support throughout a child's life and making sure teachers are well trained to help pupils with autism. And I don't think that training is sufficient high quality as it should be.
Thank you. Patrick.
Dr. Luke, Sibieta, have the IFS done any analysis on savings later down the system from early help spending?
So my colleagues certainly did some work on the Sure Start intervention, which showed that...
I would be more interested if you've got anything on the early help programmes. You mentioned social and emotional learning, they're class-based interventions. Less interested in Sure Start, but more interested in, I mean, the Nuffield has got a relatively good evaluation case, but I'm wondering if there is evidence to suggest that investing in those programs that are class-based, delivered by peer-to-peer, by TAs predominantly, drives cost savings at the Q10 high needs end of the spending spectrum.
Then I said, no, we don't have any evidence on those programs.
And why do you think that is? Why the IFS? Because it seems to be a really good opportunity here. And the whole point of that intervention, my understanding, and you alluded to this, first thing you said was it will make savings in the long term. It's a massive opportunity if we can make the case. Why has the IFS not done that?
So it would be... So I think that would point to the importance of creating good trials on educational intervention. So the Education Endowment Foundation is mostly focused on narrowing the achievement gap between children from rich and poor backgrounds, and has been trialling various general interventions. It's not currently focused on trialling interventions to sort of make special educational needs provision more effective or less costly. So you could find ways of creating trials to test different programs, but those sorts of programs haven't been tested in a robust way that you could evaluate properly.
Quick follow-up question, last question quickly. Agree, disagree. Do you think the current system where you have a notional schools grant next to basically high needs funding associated with the HCP is in itself inflationary?
I think generally agree.
Okay. I'll take that. And any other questions? Sorry, any other answers to that?
Okay, Jess.
Thank you. Just to start with Luke, in the autumn budget, the Secretary of State announced £740 million for high needs capital. Given that 63% of special schools are at or over capacity, is this planned level of investment sufficient? How is it being distributed, and is it being appropriately targeted to address the greatest needs and demand?
So I think the 740 million was mostly about capital adaptations for mainstream schools to provide more support within mainstream settings. So adapting classrooms, creating more accessible spaces. I'm not aware that the department has published any data, any information about how that's being distributed yet. So that's still ongoing, which is a little bit concerning given this money is meant to be allocated from April, which is not that far away. So it's a little bit disappointing not to have had it, not to see any information on that yet. It's also not necessarily addressing the main challenges, in that the main challenges for providing effective support for people with special needs is good staffing. It's not providing so I think that what's lacking at the moment is proper support and funding to provide training for both teachers and TAs to provide better support. That would help provide mainstream, provide good quality provision in mainstream settings.
Thank you. I mean, many of us will have parents who simply can't get a school place for their child at all. So, as much as yes, they'd be brilliant to improve training, it does seem to me that actual places are at issue in terms of special schools in particular, which may be completely at capacity or have waiting lists. Phil, I wonder whether you might have a perspective.
Well, demand for special school places has increased significantly. We're seeing more and more children, young people, particularly at secondary age range, going into specialist education. That's where this most significant rise is. We see many kids able to get through primary education, access primary education, but the shift towards secondary creates more challenge, I think, for those with SEND. And I think parents actually certainly the feedback we get locally is parents feel more comfortable with the specialist education at that point in their child's education as well. So the demand is really high. The 740 million is not really kind of scratching the surface in the capital space, I'm afraid. Probably won't be surprised to hear me say. We do need to rapidly invest in specialist provision across the country. I totally take Luke's point about the fact that we need to make sure mainstream and the quality of teaching in mainstream and the adaptability, reasonable adjustments are made in mainstream so that more children, we can affect that curve that's seeing more children and young people having to access a specialist education. Yes, we want to drive that mainstream inclusion, but at the moment the system is really struggling for capacity around specialists, and that needs to be put back in. And even if that goes a little bit too far, so many schools are over number or really kind of full that actually you could take some pressure off the system. So I think it's an area where we need significant investment. It's an area that would have a significant revenue benefit as well for the high needs block, because ultimately I think we're using more independent placements than we would want to in the system at the moment, and that's not because there isn't a really good place for the independent provision. There absolutely is, but at the moment, because of the lack of maintained or local authority state-run special schools, we are sending more children into higher cost independent placements than we would want to, and so there's a significant revenue benefit to that. I think finding the right balance in capital, investing in mainstream to make sure, because we're talking about mainstream inclusion, environment is a critical part of that. If you haven't got nurture space, sensory space to be able to support children to access their education, then those things will mean that children and young people coming out of mainstream. You know, I've had recently a conversation with a head who's looking to take their library out so they can have a nurture space. It's not really a compromise we want our schools to be making. So there is a need to invest, and I think the money that's going into mainstream is good, but we need to find a way to get the specialist provision up quickly, and that, I will say, with all due respect to it, isn't the free school programme. That could create delays. we've bid for free schools twice now. It's delayed us building our own schools because some of the money being locked up in the free schools programme run nationally. You bid for it, you wait, you find out you're not successful, then you go and build yourself. Our bids, we bid twice, we were successful both times, but our need wasn't high enough to be awarded a school, which then means we're then building ourselves. That created probably 12 months delay on both of those schools. So I would, not that there isn't a place for free schools program at some point, I would say that's a hard pause for me at the moment, and try and get the money into local authorities, where this is an area where I think LAs are best placed to respond quickly and get the right provision in if we can get the right funding into them. And I think it brings significant benefits to the system if we can do that.
Okay, thank you, Claire.
But really, to make the point that the 740 million wasn't aimed at creating extra special school places, it's aimed at creating resourced provision, specialist units. And I don't think it's been made clear what the intent of that policy is. Is it to reduce numbers in special schools? Is it to mop up demand that's coming up in the system? So I think it's difficult to start a policy without a clear end point or aim for it. I think support Phil's point about difficulties in creating new specialist provision, and the free school programme has been very successful in some cases, but there are too many cases where schools are greenlit and 6 years on they are still not open. There's been lots of examples where over market price has been paid for sites. There have been sites which have been bought and free schools then haven't actually opened, so public purse has lost money in that way. And really, at the moment, the effective way to create new provision is through the independent sector, because there's no risk to the public purse. They are bearing the full responsibility of investing tens of millions in opening new provision, and that's in part accounting for why we've got growth in the sector. Also, I would like to say that the last time government had a strategic review of the role of special schools was 2003. So it's been a long time since we all sat down and set out what is our vision for special schools. We keep talking about there'll always be a need, and of course it will be for the most complex children, but we don't actually get beyond that in terms of thinking what's the clear role that we expect special schools to play, and how do they fit with that wider system in supporting mainstream schools, in hub and spoke models. And I think that's a real policy gap.
Okay, just on that point about the independent sector, we've heard evidence that sort of cost per place is quite high in the independent sector, and perhaps 65,000 on average compared to 24,000 in the state sector. Clearly it is providing extra capacity, but how can those extra high costs be justified?
You need to look at what you're comparing with the two types. So the 23,000 that's often quoted for maintained provision is the nominal teaching and learning budget. So it doesn't include any other therapies that go in for that child, any other support that goes in for that family. It doesn't include any of the local authority management support costs. If you're looking at an average of 61,000 for the independent sector, that could also include residential provision, it will include all therapies, everything that placement costs will be reflected in that price. So there is an issue that we're not comparing like with like. If we're using the independent sector effectively, we are recognising it is highly specialist and should be for those children with the most complex needs. As I said earlier, I think at the point children are reaching our schools, which is for 70% of children at least the third school that they've attended, for 10% of children it's at least the fifth school that they've attended, their needs are high enough that it warrants specialist input. So I think there is a lot about, in a sense, the independent sector being the end point of where we've seen the systemic problems building up further down the line.
Thank you. My next question is particularly for Kate to start with. In what ways can the high needs capital funding process be improved to ensure long-term stability while remaining flexible to evolving local SEND demands? For example, there has been a suggestion that all new mainstream schools should be mandated in some way to have a specialist space or unit as they're being built. What would you say to that?
So can you just repeat that question again?
Yes, in what specific ways can the high needs capital funding process be improved to ensure long-term stability while remaining flexible to evolving local SEND demands.
Okay. I think that's a huge question. I think certainly we certainly kind of need certainly longer term funding settlements, and I think that's big in there. I think as well there is an issue here about I take the point as well from the previous speaker, and certainly one of the recommendations in the County Council Network report is around market shaping. And that says we need a new strategic relationship between state and independent sector, having a sensible discussion about actually how that's delivered. I think the thing is about a lot of what we've been talking about under this item is that local authorities do need more powers and funding to better manage SEND placements, including to establish, as we just described, establishing some new specialist schools and hubs. And I think as well we need to be able to direct academies as well as maintain schools to take pupils with SEND. And I think that's one of the issues that's kind of really big here. The local authorities, in their frustration, have a lot of the accountability for this, but none of the levers and none of the powers to actually kind of make it happen. And I think if we could get a more equitable kind of take-up of children going into mainstream schools, I know it doesn't apply kind of for every child, more children going into mainstream schools where the provision is more inclusive, it's better, it's going to meet their needs kind of much better. I think we'd be in a much better place. One of the things that I was talking to one of our senior kind of education officers at Nottinghamshire yesterday was we've got to bear in mind as well though that there is that increased complexity is the new normal, and I think we've got to kind of think that through a little bit more and decide actually kind of how we tackle that, because it is a really big issue.
Thank you.
I think there's a couple of things around the capital funding that would really help us as a local authority. I would say some longer term planning and clearer commitments over an extended period of time to capital funding. As Luke said earlier, it's still not really clear what 25-26 looks like, and we're in March. So we do really need to get visibility longer term. I think it plays to actually a funding issue across the education system as a whole. We've been working year on year. And we really need longer term budgets, and capital would be an area where we'd really want to see that. I think the idea of building mainstream schools with resource-based specialist provision within could be a really good one. I think those need to be local decisions though. I think it really fits into what is the local strategy for sufficiency of specialist provision, what's needed, what's the school culture ethos around it. You know, you could end up imposing a system nationally that might not work for some systems, and they've gone down a different pathway. So I think it's definitely something that, you know, we would certainly look at if we were building new mainstream schools. To bear in mind, we've got falling roles at the moment, so we're not looking at building too many mainstream schools right now. But I would, in this space, I would really emphasise the benefit of local decision making around it, with a commitment of long-term commitment of funding. I think most local areas would make a really good job of planning what their sufficiency is. They know what their needs are, they know what demands are, we've got the data. We would be able to do that pretty effectively if we've got visibility, and I think given the autonomy to make some of those decisions, not as a local authority, as a local schools forum, which is all the key stakeholders. That would be what I'd advocate, I think.
Thank you. Manuela.
Can I come on that?
Yeah, really briefly, if that's okay. We are mindful of time.
One of the problems is, I think, in terms of how we spend capital funding in this space is the granularity of the data available. So when we talk about SEND and numbers, SEND is a hugely generic term, and we don't really understand, and we think the government needs to do some work looking at the current provision you've got in place, the mixture of mainstream, SEN units, special schools and so forth, against what we know about the type of need. So school capacity survey data doesn't attach the type of need to the setting. So there needs to be better connection in that. I think they use pupil census data, but it's best guess, if you like. We need to be far better about that to know what's required. We know there are 4,000 more children being supported in special schools than there's space for at the moment. We know mainstream schools are being asked to support some children who everyone agrees should be in a specialist place. So, but we're not really very good at the moment of understanding what the mismatch is exactly in terms of what's required and where, because the data is not granular enough, we don't think, to allow us to do that. So there needs to be some work on that, which will allow you to be more effective in how you allocate capital funding.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Just to accommodate colleagues who maybe need to leave the meeting a little bit earlier, I'm going to cover the questions that we have on alleviating financial pressures and encouraging savings. First of all, Lloyd, so I'll bring in Serena to ask your question, number 13, if that's okay, and then we'll go to Lloyd's.
Okay, so thank you, Chair. So my question is around the statutory override, particularly with the financial difficulties faced by local authorities, exasperated by the same crisis. So this question goes to Councillor Foale, Luke and Phil. To start off with, according to DFE estimates, 43% of local authorities will have deficits near or above their reserves when the statutory override ends in March 2026. This is going to put many at risk of bankruptcy. When do local authorities need a decision from the department on how it plans to deal with this situation? What support is needed to help local authorities maintain stability before and after March 2026? So I'll start off with Councillor Foale.
I think this may be a question more for some of my colleagues to this, but I think the key thing is it needs to happen soon. Yeah. And County Council are extremely worried about this. I mean, this is a serious kind of situation. An awful lot of County Council, and this could actually literally bankrupt some of them overnight. And the 4 billion deficit, which is kind of there at present, is money. It's already been spent, and I think that's what we've got to get a head around. It's money that's already spent. So it's realistically, it's unlikely to ever be paid back by local authorities, given the scale of the crisis in local government funding. So they're going to need some help, aren't they? Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's important to state at the start that it's a total farce. There's no way that so one of two things is going to happen in April is that local authorities will get partly bailed out or the statutory override will continue. One of those two things will happen because the government is not going to let that sheer number of local authorities go bust overnight. I think it's just about reasonable not to be setting out a solution until the spending review, because I think it's reasonable to be able to use any changes in funding that happen after April 2026, be incentivising differences in provision and how local authorities provide provision. I think anything beyond the spending review gets to unacceptable levels, because I suspect there are local authorities who are already making financial decisions on the default assumption that it won't continue, because they kind of have to. But the politics of it are just ridiculous. So I think the spending review is the appropriate time for setting out a solution.
Okay. And Phil, to you, if you could share any consultation that's taken place, if any, between the department and local authorities regarding the ending of the statutory override, and what engagement would local authorities like to see?
To my knowledge, I don't think there's been any. I mean, there's obviously individual conversations with the DFE, but there's not been any kind of consultation specifically around the extension of it. The extension of the statutory override is just kicking this issue down the road, and it will just continue. You know, if we extend it again, we're just going to have larger and larger deficits to deal with. So at some point, we have to make significant changes in the system. And I think it feels to me like at the moment we're at the tipping point. I've been working on this for 5 or 6 years. This is kind of coming towards the tipping point of when do we make a decision about what we're going to do to make the system financially sustainable so that you can then have a sensible conversation about what happens to the accumulated deficits, which is obviously what the statutory override is covering. Until such, just from a purely financial perspective, I don't think anybody can really have a sensible conversation about how we treat the deficits until we're clear that there is a pathway to financial sustainability in year, because all that will happen is those deficits will recur again. I think it feels like we're at a point where we're talking about and we're hearing about funding reform, we're hearing about mainstream inclusion as a priority, and investment in mainstream is a key part of that, I would say. We've heard about how tight school funding is. So, that's really important. And we're talking about potentially legislative change. I don't see how you move forward in this space without some degree of legislative change that is going to affect this system, because it is out of control. I think from our perspective, I think the statutory override if it's extended, like I said, it's just kicking the problem further down the road. So if in the coming months, up to the comprehensive spending review, we're seeing funding reform, a real commitment and an understanding of what this mainstream inclusion agenda is focused on and how we're kind of investing in that. The 25-26 funding allocation for schools didn't suggest that there was a significant commitment to investing in mainstream education. It was probably the lowest it's been for 4 or 5 years in terms of mainstream school funding. And we need to see what legislative change is going to look like. You could then have a conversation about how these cumulative deficits are treated. I think the other bit that our Section 151 officer would want me to mention is this money has been spent and it is costing local authorities interest, or in some cases they're borrowing, I think, or to fund it as well. So it's a lot of, it's, you know, north of £4 billion we're talking about now. This is a significant amount of public money that's already been spent. So I think that the override itself, you know, if it's extended for a year, another year, fine. But if we keep going down this pathway, we're just creating more of a kind of a challenge for us at some point. So it needs to be resolved. And I think now is the right, from what I've seen, now is the point where we need to do that. Otherwise, the system will finally crash, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to be in Lloyd.
Thank you, Chair. On the Public Accounts Committee, we recently had a report into send, and we were concerned particularly around the safety valve agreements and related interventions, that they didn't really provide long-term financial sustainability, and in fact it felt more like a sort of piecemeal approach where we were just trying to pick off those local authorities that are in the worst position financially. So what lessons do you feel have been learned from their implementation up until now, and how can we amend and improve our approaches in the future, particularly so we can actually see these interventions actually deliver the longer term financial sustainability that we clearly need? I'll start with, shall I start with Councillor Foale on that one?
Just kind of last replace it. Which one?
Safety valve and delivery head of
program. Oh, right, okay. Yeah, I mean, tell me if I've got the question wrong, but I think what you're asking here is actually what we do about this more broadly. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think one thing that I'm sure members of this committee also share, but we also felt on the Public Accounts Committee, was that the valve approach, it wasn't one that was actually going to provide long-term financial sustainability. Yeah, okay, it was very much just sort of coming in when the situation has already deteriorated quite substantially, and you're just trying to sort of put back together those areas which are worst impacted. But actually, if we want to take a more longer-term, more comprehensive approach, what can we learn from the mistakes made, and how do we amend and improve that in the future?
Well, I think then, so excuse me, I might be kind of seeping into another question here, but for me, you can tackle the financial issue, and although it will be difficult, and it will, there's an awful lot of money needs to go in there. But if you do that, if you don't then do some reform, go into reform, and actually look at how this system can work better, this kind of very, very broken system, then this is just going to continue. And I think that's something a lesson that really does need to be learned. We just cannot go on how we are at the moment without the capacity, without kind of really, really proper reform. And I mean, there's a risk that a requirement to publish data on SC&D provision versus need will create more bureaucracy with the system without any real benefit. And again, we come back to the need, to the requirement for a needs-based system. So that would create further financial pressure on the system at a time when resources are wholly inadequate. If the purpose is to hold local authorities to account, it will fail, as many of the problems in terms of provision are out of direct control. And again, it comes to us levers. We've got the accountability kind of without the powers to kind of do very much about it, or the funds. For instance, we can't just build special schools without central government direction. So it is kind of really difficult as far as local authorities. What we do think is there should be better data collection for outcomes of children and people with SND, where there's very little information currently available. And again, coming back to the idea that the statutory delivery is for local authorities, but we don't deliver and we don't have any money to do this. This really needs significant reform. We need, inclusivity crops up a lot, doesn't it really? It's not been mentioned kind of head on at the moment. if we do not provide more, we need to provide more inclusive system, more inclusive schools, so more of our children can actually kind of get the broad curriculum, the broad benefit of being in a mainstream school. And I think that's a message that, again, needs to come across very clearly. If we incentivise schools to value kind of academic achievement, I know they don't all do this, but academic achievement over inclusion, then we're not going to get anywhere with any of this.
Phil, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I think on DBV and safety valve, I think we've learned the lessons. I think they were local solutions to a national problem. So we were looking at through. I mean, we were involved in the DB Delivering Better Value programme, which was the precursor for those local authorities who weren't in as significant deficit as those in the safety valve. And there were 54 other authorities with us, and I think we went through that process. You know, I suspect there was an expectation that there would be a kind of opportunity to find lots of funding that could be used in other ways or not being spent in the right way, and that wasn't the outcome of that programme. It found broadly, I think that the funding is being used to deliver the statutory services. It's the demand in the system that's driving the issues. So trying to fix this financial issue at a local level, which is what the safety valve and I think the DBV programme were trying to do, is not going to work. It is a national system issue. I think the DFE and from the reforms we're now starting to see and the kind of the things we're starting to hear, it does feel like it is being treated as a national issue, not a local one. But the safety valve and delivering better value didn't provide the outcomes because those LAs kind of in those programmes were not able to affect the levers that would help really address the issue. They are national ones, not local ones.
Yeah. Thank you. Sarah?
So if we were to face into the quite catastrophic situation of the statutory override ending in March 2026, what protections could or should be put in place to ensure that the children with SEND and their families continue receiving the support they are entitled to if local authorities were issuing Section 114s based on that?
That's a hard question.
Sure. Yeah, but I'll tell our position, I guess, is our position is that we think there needs to be something that helps to cancelling those debts, the high needs debts for local authorities, some kind of way of doing that. Like I said before, any additional funding that then's put in place just gets consumed into that deficit, so it's a problem. It's really hard to find any evidence within either safety valve or delivering better value schemes that they're really substantively achieved their original aims, particularly in terms of the pupil outcomes element that they were talking about, because alongside that we know that the trajectory of need has continued to go to rise, so they've been battling a kind of a rising tide in terms of the sort of level of need. And you have to say, when you look at the fact that there are 60% of local authorities that are in one of those two programmes, it begs the question about the level of investment that's happened over time that's allowed that to happen. If you were talking lower numbers, you could scrutinise the local authorities and how effective they've been in those, but you're talking nearly 2/3 of local authorities in that situation. That kind of asks some fundamental questions. It was good to hear in November that there's ISOS have been commissioned to start looking at some research about how those programmes impact on children and young people's and families' outcomes. But that was 3 years after they were brought in. It would have been good in terms of lessons learned. It would be good to start that alongside the schemes themselves and follow them more closely. When that report, I think, is due to be published in June, I think it'll be really important the government respond to that quickly, because it'll give you some indication about the kind of impact that has been on pupils' outcomes by putting in that kind of programme. But if you're saying they seem to be short-term sort of answers to a substantive problem that wasn't really going to be something you could do over the longer term. In terms of if they don't do anything after the statutory override, it's been pretty clear local authorities are saying about the risk of bankruptcy, and then you're talking about doing away with anything non-statutory, and that will have a huge effect on what happens within schools as in wider services too. So that will be, we think, a pretty catastrophic sort of situation to allow that just to happen.
Yeah, that last point is the key one from an LA perspective. If we are put in that position, and I would take Luke's view that I don't know that you can see 50, it says 43%, but you're probably closer to 50% by the time you get there. 50% of local authorities in this position, I think that's probably untenable. But if we were in that situation, our responsibility at that point, and that I think it'd be taken out of our hands to some extent, would be just to deliver the statutory provision. And then you're in a position where anything that's non-statutory, and we had a long conversation earlier about early intervention and the benefits of that. Those are the kind of things, if they are in the system at the moment, that would probably come out of the system because they will be non-statutory. So it's the statutory stuff that would be protected. So the ECP process and all those things would have to continue in its, because it's a statutory process. But the kind of earlier intervention, the wider work in the system through the Dedicated Schools grant, and probably would have a material impact on other council services, frankly. I suspect, given the scale of these deficits, it would impact on other services across local authorities that are not statutory.
We'll go back to Marwella, thank you.
Chair. So my questions are about data and how data-driven decision-making can be used to forward plan. So the first question is to Councillor Foale, Luke and Phil. What adjustments are needed for local education authorities to efficiently plan and provide for new SEND schools and SEND places?
Do you want to go first?
Yes, start if you like, if that's helpful. So I think we've got good local data. I think with SEND provision, the key is to look at more regional planning, because a specialist provision will often support across multiple local authorities, whether it's independent or state funded. There will be children accessing it from different authorities. So I think there is a real need for better regional data. There is some collaboration in the regions around it. You could argue you could scale that up at a macro level to national data. I think but locally we know what our demand is. We know what where the needs are arising. We talked about the rising level of need. The predominant element of the rise for us is in social and emotional mental health, speech and language, and in the early primary phases of education. It was certainly exacerbated by the pandemic when children were out of early years provision. So we know we know where the need is. I think in terms of planning for SEND provision, we do need to start looking beyond local authority boundaries and start at a regional or national level to plan out what our provision would look like if we really want it to be effective across the country and as efficient as it can be as well.
So I'd say it's not necessarily about better data. So as Phil has articulated, there's already fairly good data on sort of levels of need across local authorities, and it's fairly consistent. If you look across local authorities in terms of the types of need that are driving demand, it's autistic spectrum disorders, speech language and communication needs, social emotional mental health needs, including ADHD. It's really, really consistent across local authorities and regions. It then becomes about an articulation of the view of the role of different actors in the system. And I think I definitely support Claire's view that there's a lack of articulation about the role of the specialist sector in the system. And it's largely been about responding to EHCPs and deciding there's not enough capacity, so we're going by provision in the independent specialist sector, when historically the role of the independent specialist sector was about providing for high cost, low incidence needs. And it's partly become about mopping up capacity constraints in the state sector. There needs to be a clear articulation of the view of when different types of needs should be provided by the specialist sector, when they're better provided for a mainstream setting, what the role of parental preference is in that choice, what the role is for local authority direction is in that setting. It's more about an articulation of the different roles of actors in the system and how the system can best provide for different types of needs.
Can I come in on that? I think I would agree with you, Luke, about we should have good access to data on needs. What we're really poor on is data around outcomes. So, the last green paper was titled Right Support, Right Place, Right Time. Actually, we don't have answers to what is the right support, the right place and the right time for so many young people. And that means that placement decisions are not always very well thought through and not strategically commissioned. If we're thinking about need and that a child with this need inevitably needs X, it's not, sophisticated enough to understand that making this intervention at this time returns this value for this child, and I think that's what we're really poor on.
Thank you.
Yeah, just add something that's perhaps another issue here. I think we've got to remember here as well, we're not just talking about money here, are we talking about children? And I think that's something that, you know, sometimes you can get lost in all this. And one of the suggestions in the ISOS report is actually that we establish a new destination and progression service in each local area, and that way you'll be able to kind of track children with SEND and to kind of see what the outcomes are, and actually whether it's actually working and how well they're doing. Because that period of transition is a really tricky one. It's actually where the SEND system at the moment is failing badly. I think, again, that's something really we need to kind of think about. Because when they approach transition to adult, and the immediate period of a few years after this transition, actually it is a very difficult period for them. So it would then provide a better view of the effectiveness of approaches to SEND. Then you've got some kind of valuable data that you can actually say, okay, this is working, we continue to do it, or it's not. And I think that is something that could be very good. We need to know what the outcomes are, don't we, for our children, and I don't think we necessarily have that data.
About the information that you need as county councils to be able to plan effectively for the need in your area and commission services accordingly. Do you think you have that data, access to that data at the moment, or are there changes that should be made?
No, I think there will be changes, but that's one of the changes that I would suggest that we could do. We do some of that at Nottinghamshire County Council, but it would be good if it was in a better, firmer framework. Yeah.
I have a question, Rob. So the National Association of Head Teachers previously called for the government to publish data on SEND provision against the SEND need. So why is the data needed in current and future capacity planning for the SEND system?
So, as I said before, it remains a bit unclear to us how currently the school capacity survey data that's collected, because it doesn't attach to need specifically, it's being aware of what the provision is required, hence why we said we need to see a published sort of set of data that shows the range of needs, and as Luke says, where it's best supported against the provision that's available, to see where there's maybe mismatches. It appears to be a particular issue because the type of need does impact on the type of provision you require, whether that's in mainstream or wherever. For certain pupils who might have certain specific physical needs, mobility aids or whatever, and the ratios you'd have with staff that you'd require to support them, clearly the capacity is then affected about how many children you could support in a classroom space on that basis. Understanding if we have the right type and mix of school settings, special, mainstream, SEN units and so forth, to meet the mix of specific needs of the pupils, we think is really essential if you're looking to try and have some kind of sustainable long-term plan that is able to respond to need, even on a capital basis as much as in terms of school environments. And we think it's going to prove absolutely essential for the government if they're really committed to this inclusive education agenda. And when they describe that inclusion, I'd add, there seems to be a lot of discussion around the mainstream elements in inclusion. If we're talking about a really inclusive system, we need to include every single type of school. Otherwise, you immediately disenfranchise a group of children who will never, ever be supported in a mainstream setting unless you have a complete radical overhaul in the kind of provision we're able to provide. So we need to be careful we don't, by trying to be inclusive in mainstream, we don't exclude certain groups of children, young people and their families. But that's why we think the data is so important, and how you connect type of need with the kind of provision that will best meet that need.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jess.
What are the key challenges related to the cost and efficiency of home-to-school transport for children with SEND, and what improvements can be made to improve affordability and effectiveness? We hear quite a lot about very, very long journeys being made by students to get to their schools and so forth, and a concern that if only we could recoup some of those costs by making that provision slightly more local, then we might be able to save money that way. What do you be your reflection, Kate?
I think it's true. I mean, the spending on SEND transport is a key factor in all this kind of financial difficulty, isn't it, really? Certainly the dramatic increase has been driven almost entirely by the growth for SEND home school transport. I think that the issue here is where the SEND the SEND children need individualised travel arrangements. So kind of once you've got a set up situation where you've decided where the child's going to go, then that kind of stays in place. They're not commodities that you can move about. You can't rationalise it halfway through and say, well, that child's going to that school, you need to go to that school or do so. You can't do that. But it is expensive, because sometimes passenger assistants are needed as well. It can kind of get very expensive. So I think what we need, we come back to the capital investment for councils to create more specialist school places. I mean, we've been there just now, haven't we, really? So considering a notional kind of means testing policy, perhaps, where parents over a specified income are required to make a financial contribution. I know that's controversial and some parents won't be able to afford it, but if it was carefully means tested, it might be worth considering. And ensuring that SEND tribunals don't rule on cases until there's a full consideration of transport costs. And that's one of the frustrations with local authorities as well. If you go to tribunals, they don't have to consider the financial kind of impact of all this. They just kind of do it on a legal basis. And that is actually quite difficult because, again, local authorities in a situation where they have the accountability, but they don't have the levers or the capital or the money to actually put it into practice. It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
There's a couple of parts around home to school transport. I think there's in the specialist space, we are talking about provision that is providing specialist education, and by that kind of context, it's very, very hard to make sure you've got that kind of very specific provision across every part of the county. So for Gloucestershire, we've got both urban and rural, big county. It can take quite a lot of time to get across it, and we do have children travelling long distances for some provision, but it isn't possible to have the level of specialist provision in every part of the county because the demand isn't sufficient enough to meet that, and that's where some of that regional commissioning can really help in making sure that we've got the right provision available. We're always going to have, I think, by the nature of the kind of support we're providing, some travel time for some children because we cannot feasibly fund the kind of levels of provision to make sure that it's accessible in every part of the county. It just wouldn't operate. I think there's a real challenge in the mainstream system as well. We're seeing a lot of children and young people with education, health and care plans not going to their local schools, and whether that's parents getting them to school, or whether they're looking to rely on or access home to school transport, we're increasingly seeing choice for mainstream schools. If a particular school is, to the points that Rob was making earlier, has a reputation for being particularly inclusive, you'll start to see that attract children from quite a distance, and parents prepared to get their kids to school, for 45-minute hour journeys. We try and keep distances down, but the reality is, across a county like ours, we would always have some travel time. In terms of spend, the key thing is we're trying to avoid high-cost single-use provision, and it's the private sector as well. We use a lot of private sector, obviously taxi, bus services. When demand is so high and the supply isn't there, the private sector is not optimum because they can charge what they wish to because the competition isn't there. The private sector works best when there is competition, and there isn't enough competition in that space. So as a local authority, you are commissioning from a very small pool. So the costs are driven up by the nature of the kind of system we're operating in, I guess, around transport.
Thank you. And in the last evidence session, we heard about a loophole allowing local authorities discretion over funding transport for young people with SEND after the age of 16. What would be the impact on local authorities if this funding were made mandatory?
More cost. It would be the short answer. I mean, we do provide post-16 transport for children with SEND on a discretionary basis where it's needed. So in our policy, we do cover, and we're funding post-16 transport for over 350 children with EHCP. So we do provide that support because fundamentally, if there's a long distance there and parents aren't able to get their children or young people in this instance, I guess, to the provision, then we would help and support to do that, not least on the basis that it will be quite high cost provision, and the attendance then tends to go down if they're not able to get there, and you can end up funding, you know, £60,000 a year placement, which is only attended half the time. So it is something we do support in principle at the moment, but it's not for every case. It's on discretion when it's needed, or when we feel it's needed, I should say.
Thank you. Back to Manuela.
Claire, the National Audit Office warned that a reliance on independent specialist schools for specialist provision may lead to poor value for money, and I quote. What is your response to this, and what role do you think independent specialist schools should play in SEND provision?
I think I've not seen persuasive evidence that they are poor value for money. NAS commissioned research in 2023 looking at the value returned to the public purse through meeting need effectively, and good independent provision is an investor-save intervention. So I think I'm concerned that statements are made about value for money, and it tends to be, I think, on the basis that children placed in independent schools don't need to be there. And I think, as I said earlier, at the point of placement, I think there are very few schools who say that they have children who really would have thrived in other settings because they've been through multiple failures already. I think the wider issue is about, are you ending up placing children in specialist provision whose needs could have been met at an earlier point? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think there are also concerns about where specialist placements have been able to address need to a certain point, and a young person could move on to a less intense setting, that actually there are very few options to move a young person on. So I've spoken to head teachers who have a real frustration that they could move a child, but actually the local authority has no options to find another placement for that child at a lower intensity. So I think there are concerns about that. Going back to the National Audit Office report, what they said about the spend on independent schools was that it had increased because of the numbers of placements being made increasing, not as a result of the price per placement increasing. And I think that's important to address Phil's last point, which suggests that independent schools are somehow putting up fees to take advantage of the fact that there's not capacity elsewhere. And the National Audit Office didn't find that. And I think it's important to note that this is a volume issue rather than a price per placement issue.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on the panel?
Sure.
And then Rob.
I largely agree with what Claire said. So we've seen the numbers of pupils in independent special schools go from around 12,500 in 2016 to around 27,500 today. So the volume has increased. Independent special school places are always going to be more expensive than state-funded special school places because historically and currently they are there to provide for high-cost, low-incidence needs that can't really be delivered very well in the state sector. So they have a really important role to play in the system, and the price will always be higher. One of the reasons why local and state government have been using independent special schools more is because of the lack of capacity in state-funded special schools. And when you go try and finding capacity a very short space of time, as Phil's been talking about with transport, it applies even more so at the provision level. It's going to be expensive. If the government wants to save money, it would need to be providing more state-funded special school places, so that, or better support in mainstream schools, so it never goes down that road.
I think Rob and Rob, Claire.
Okay, thank you.
Rob, Kate, and then.
I guess that there were stories in the press, wasn't there, about companies backed with private equity and health wealth funds and so forth, making profits out of particularly, I think, social care and children's homes and that kind of angle. I think that's where people start to get very worried about the kind of levels of costs when they see children being educated in that kind of anyway that kind of setting. As we said, for small numbers of children with really complex needs, by their definition of their education, health and social care provision is going to be more expensive because they need to be given far more complex provision to support their needs. I guess it's the checks and balances you need to put in place in a national way to make sure that there aren't those sort of risks that we've heard potentially to local authorities in terms of the kind of funding they have to then put forward if it wasn't regulated well enough or kept on top. But generally speaking, there's always going to be a need for that kind of provision. What it needs to be is some kind of national way of operating that, so that there is an expectation and an understanding of when the costs are high, what is it paying for, and also that they are properly meeting those children's needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will always be a role for the independent sector, and I think what I talked about before was there should be a much closer, more strategic working relationship between the state and independent sector, and also kind of less silo type system, kind of where we can kind of share experience and kind of share good practice. But if we're going to kind of do this in a cost-effective way and in a way that probably meets the needs of most children, a core shift's got to be to look about the whole system helps to move children back to the mainstream as far as possible. You know, putting things in place in mainstream schools, the support in place so more children can kind of access mainstream education. And the way to address the present dysfunction is to increase the supply of those low-cost specialist placements and improve the ability of mainstream schools to meet the needs of kind of more of our children with special educational need. But I think you know, the independent sector does have a role to play, and you know, they do some excellent work. But clearly, it is more expensive, and I think that's the way that we could address it.
Just a few things. Just on the point about the private sector in this space, we do a lot of work with the independent sector, and generally most of the providers we're working with, they're not in this for making excess profits. It's about providing high quality provision for children and young people. So definitely don't feel like this is a space where we're seeing that kind of exploitation from the private sector, if that's kind of how that previous comment came across. I think, because it was related to transport, not to the independent placements, I take Luke's point entirely, and it's what we see across the region, is that because there is a shortage of state-funded specialist provision, we have an over-reliance on the independent sector to support a lack of capacity, and they are by their nature more expensive provision. You know, we've done the analysis that strips out all of the really high-cost joint-funded placements and looked at the comparable placement between kind of local authority state-funded placement and an independent placement, and you're broadly talking £25,000 a year more cost in the independent sector. That's not a critique. Their offer is significantly greater, I think, than we're able to make through the state sector. So, but it is very clearly an area where there's an over-reliance, and I think probably the use of the independent sector has doubled, certainly in our local area, doubled in the last 5 years. And that needs to come back from a funding perspective, and children.
You're going to have to encourage our witnesses to be a little bit more succinct in your answers so that we can cover all of the topics that we want to have evidence from for the remainder of the session. We're very pressed for time at this point. Manuela, are you?
Yeah, so Claire again, what are the barriers between, to an effective collaboration between local authorities and independent school provision, and also what steps are needed to overcome these barriers?
It currently relies on people having time and goodwill, both of which I think are in quite short supply at the moment. There's no formal structure that supports schools and local authorities working together strategically, and that's something we have had in the past. So in the early noughties we had the SEND regional partnerships, which were a really effective way of bringing together schools and local authorities from all sectors to think strategically about what regions needed. That morphed into the regional commissioning partnerships, which again provided dedicated resource and a real task for providers and local authorities to come together. And I would love to see something like that back again, because with the best one in the world, if it's left down to necessity being the mother of invention, she ends up being quite a poor mother. It just doesn't happen. And we've seen that the dedicated resource makes a difference. I think notwithstanding that, there are great examples of independent schools offering training to schools in their area, offering outreach where they would go into a school, offering in-reach where staff from mainstream schools come into see how they do things. We've seen fewer examples of dual placements, particularly between mainstream and independent special schools. They're not going to be right for a large number of children, but they would be possible for some. But what we really need, I think, is some sort of structure to make it happen, because it doesn't seem to organically occur.
Okay, thank you. Anyone of the Phil or Councillor Foale to add to this? No?
I mean, there are some good informal relationships certainly in the southwest, and there is an attempt through, and there are some emerging regional structures coming through the DFE now as well. The RIO in the southwest, there is some good engagement around kind of joint commissioning, both at a state-funded and at an independent level, and that's been really, really helpful. But it is not yet properly formalised, and I think that we'd advocate for something similar to that.
Mark.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your answers so far. I absolutely accept that there are many private schools that are not in it for excessive profit making. They are in it to help children and to teach them properly. But it still doesn't get away from the fact that, you know, the cost of a private school place, specialist provision, is over 60,000, and a state school's place is about 24,000. And that some council leaders do say that the biggest pressure on their high needs costs comes from the fact that they have to place children in these independent schools. So my question is quite specific, and I understand that we're short on time, so I'll keep it as brief as I can. Collective commissioning frameworks, regional price agreements, do these have any role to play in curbing what some describe as excess profit making? This question is specifically for Kate, for Claire and for Phil, but I'll take answers from anyone. Claire, go ahead, please.
Well, we've had quite a lot of examples of regional procurement frameworks which have tried to set price, but generally set at a price that's not actually deliverable. So people come onto the framework but then actually couldn't make placements under it. So I think if we focus only on procurement solutions, we are not going to have success. If it was a commissioning framework where we were strategically thinking about likely current and future need and could then think what that would cost to deliver, and it was a collaborative relationship between providers and local authorities, not a procurement, we are the purchaser, we do unto you as provider, there would be more hope. But actually I have yet in 20 years to see a procurement framework for SEN that has been effective at securing involvement from providers and or realising cost savings. Economically, it's a very imperfect market. It's not quick to enter the market. It's not easy to leave the market. It's very highly regulated. So, particularly with an excess of demand over supply, it is very difficult to effect change.
Thank you.
I think, I mean, this isn't a question I expected to have, but I think it's that kind of procurement, more kind of regional, more strategic procurement, but has worked to some extent in some of the provision that we've provided at Nottinghamshire County Council. So it could work, and it may be kind of worth looking at. But when you've got this kind of free market in kind of this situation, it is very difficult. And one of the things I think that perhaps would be helpful is this idea of kind of a price cap mechanism. And again, I think certainly the County Council Network kind of very supportive of the idea that actually we kind of cap excessive profits, we kind of do it that way around. But I mean, I guess the idea of actually doing it more regional and kind of doing it so you've got kind of more clout in terms of procurement and in terms of strategy, kind of working with the market in a more strategic way, I think sounds very sensible to me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then Phil.
They're challenged. I mean, the commissioning arrangements, joint ones, are challenging, I think, and the procurement frameworks, as Claire said. I think probably the key thing in this issue is we solve the cause of the issue itself. It would feel like a sticking plaster, to be honest, because actually the cause is the fact that we don't have enough state-funded specialist provision. That's why most local authorities are overusing in the independent sector. And that's why most authorities will say it's one of their biggest concerns, the rising cost, because they are having to fund more placements in the independent sector than they would wish. So I think that's that's the kind of route to kind of try and address the issue. I think our experience working with providers, and I think this comes back to a point that around some of the guidance that comes with a dedicated schools grant when we get it. You know, the national funding formula, we started off with the schools block, school funding. The national funding formula is prescribed, very heavily prescribed. The high needs block doesn't often, it has a couple of times prescribed what inflationary uplifts we should provide for special school top-up or specialist top-ups for education, health and care plans. But most times it doesn't come with guidance around an inflationary uplift into special. And as a consequence, it then becomes hard to have the conversation with the independent sector about what increases look like in the independent sector. If we have a really clear view, and our approach locally has always been to try and mirror at a high needs block level the HCP uplifts alongside what the national funding formula is doing. So if the national funding formula, as it did last year, went up 2.4%, we were looking at 2.43% uplift for HCPs. That was then our starting point with the independent sector when they were looking at that. And in the main, I think we negotiate fairly close to those numbers, but it's often at 4 or 5% rather than the 2 or 3%, because I think the staffing costs are generally higher and the inflationary uplifts are therefore a little bit higher for them. So I think some degree of control within the system around what inflationary uplifts look like in the specialist space would be really helpful, I think, for most. Not that we're then in a position necessarily to control that with the private sector, but it forms a basis for a conversation, which is what we've been trying to do, like I say, locally.
Okay, no, and then very briefly, to the same three people, do you accept the premise that some organisations are driving excessive profits, taking excessive profits out of the situation?
Are you able to give us your definition of excessive profits?
So essentially, going above and beyond what they need to deliver education to children.
I think it's very difficult when, I've heard a number of people use the term excessive profits, but not yet defined what that looks like in terms of percentages. So often I think with the social care, people were looking at the LGA Commission report by Andrew Rome and the EBITDA for the top 20 social care providers. And I know people were concerned that I think the highest of those in the year in question was about 26%. But that doesn't tell you what happened with that money. I think people assumed that there was 26% somehow going to shareholders or owners. Didn't look about what was then done with that in terms of reinvesting back in. We also don't have disaggregated figures that look at special schools, so all we've got is the social care provider data. So it's very difficult to start meaningful discussions about is something excessive without having that basis of what are we actually talking about, what does it look like, what happens to that money. So I think if the real concern is that there is some money going to shareholders, I think that's a very different and specific issue that from looking at what happens across independent schools as a whole. And also, if we go back to thinking about who's meeting capacity at the moment, who is able to go and build new provision, we've acknowledged across the panel that that is the independent sector at the moment. And if someone is going to take the risk of investing 30, 40 million in setting up a new school, that capital is going to come from someone who wants to see some return on their investment. So I think, in a sense, that explains why we're at where we're at now.
Yeah.
And if we don't want it to be like that, I think we've all talked about investing at a different point in the system so that we don't reach that point.
Yeah, no, I understand. So you'd want to see a clear definition. You mentioned shareholders there, though. Would that fall outside the definition? If somebody's paying dividends to shareholders, is that automatically excessive?
I do need to encourage brevity, I'm afraid.
Apologies, sorry, Chair. Yes, I was getting...
No, it's fine to answer, but you can be brief, please.
I think there's a question I'd hand back to you to say, it needs to be clear, what is the element of profit making or surplus that is problematic because considerable amounts of it are actually invested back in new provision or improving provision.
Okay, I'll promise I'll leave it there unless there's any final comments.
Can I just come in very briefly? I just have a very firm, because I'm going to cover my Labour councillor hat on that, I have a very, very firm belief that actually But a private investment company should not be paying money to shareholders out of the public purse. That money needs to be spent on our children. And I'm not saying that companies shouldn't be into it and shouldn't kind of be able to kind of provide a good service and pay their people properly and all that, provide the service properly. But I've had 2 investment companies ring me up when they saw my name on this invitation to ask me if I'd be interested in some consultancy around SEND so they could help design their services. Which I must confess I batted back, but that I felt very uncomfortable with that. That's not where we should be going. We should be looking at good state, in the main, good low-cost, good state provision for our children in inclusive schools, and that's where I think we should be.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. We are going to come back to the question of accountability for the independent sector, which I think may get us back into that territory in a moment, but I'm going to bring in Caroline for a question about accountability for local authorities.
Thank you, Chair. The entitlements of children and young people with SEND are explicit in the Children and Families Act 2024. So, question to Kate and Phil. Why do you think local authorities are continuing to allow cases to escalate to the SEND tribunal despite the financial and reputational costs? And what role can early intervention and dispute resolution play in avoiding this? When we see from some local authorities that they lose virtually every tribunal they go to, so what's the point?
Do you want me to go first? Have a go. I mean, I think the problem is because the way the system is set up, nobody's fault, but because of the way the system is set up, I think parents quite often see that the only way they're going to get the very best for their children is by going to a tribunal. So you can try mediation, and I know certainly they do in Nottinghamshire, I'm sure they do elsewhere, and sometimes I'm sure it works, so you get that graduated response that was set out in the HCP. But if parents perceive that actually they're not going to get a very good deal out of that, or they'll get a better deal about going to a tribunal, that's what they'll do. And again,
I'm really sorry to interrupt you on that point. I think many parents would say their child's entitlement in the law is really clear. The tribunal is a part of the legal system. It's there to adjudicate under the law as to whether local authorities are meeting their strict obligations under the law. I think many parents would find it really concerning and distasteful to talk about the tribunal system as a way of getting a better deal for their child. We're talking about a part of the legal system adjudicating, and the question that we're really interested in is why local authorities keep on forcing parents to go to the tribunal to get what their children are entitled to in the law when they lose at such a high rate because the legal system determines that the local authority is not meeting their strict legal obligations.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to offend anybody, and that wasn't what I'm saying. Cannot blame parents for wanting the very best for their children, and clearly that's what they're fighting for. But if what is happening here in terms of the kind of tribunals, some of the support that actually the parents are getting, this is get written into EHCP, county councils have no budget for. That's the argument I'm saying. I'm not saying that parents are wrong or that local authorities are right. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that's the situation. And actually, mediation will only work if it's actually if there's an element of leverage between both the local authority and the parents, and that isn't really what's happening at the moment.
But surely the cost of repeatedly going to tribunal isn't helping county council budgets either.
So I don't. Well, in that case, I don't know what the solution is. To be honest with you. Because going back to the point I made before, if mediation isn't working as far as the parents are concerned, and then they go to tribunal, if the local authority is saying we haven't got this provision or we can't afford this, then what happens next? They go to tribunal.
I think the tribunal space is really challenging because of the outcomes. I can only speak locally for what we do, but also from conversations I have with other local authorities, I don't think anybody's going to tribunal frivolously. And the work, the cost involved will tell you that why would anybody want to do that? It's a stressful process for everybody involved, including local authority officers, but most so parents. So nobody's doing it frivolously. I think the challenge becomes where you see the difference between what the local authority and I guess through the HCP process is being kind of decided is needed versus what potentially is wanted. And if those two things are at odds, that's generally when we end up in a tribunal.
And in 98% of cases, the tribunal finds that they are at odds, and that the local authority hasn't got the judgment right. And I suppose the question that we're really interested in, because it's so prevalent within this debate, is why local authorities, knowing, like, you must know that you're likely to lose because the stats say you're likely to lose. And, you know, was it Einstein who said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting to get a different outcome out of it. That isn't what's happening. I
think certainly our rates of tribunal as a consequence have reduced, but we go when we feel we've got a case to be heard. I mean, we've recently agreed to pay a residential post-16 placement through tribunal, which we took through. That was an additional £300,000 over 3 years, £100,000 a year increase in the placement cost because residential provision was wanted, and we didn't feel residential provision was needed. It hadn't been needed up until the point of post-16, and then at post-16 residential provision was being asked for. That's £100,000 a year additional cost on that placement. Obviously, like you say, we lost that tribunal, but if you can see potentially why we're going into that conversation saying we don't think that is the right use of the public money, given that we don't have it, which is kind of part of the reason we're here. I think it is a system that needs really clearly rethinking, and as we look at legislation moving forward, we need to be in a position where we're not putting parents and carers and local authorities and the school system as well at odds with each other, which is, when you read the ISOS report, it's basically what it's telling you, that this system isn't working, it's crashing, but actually it's not working for anybody. Nobody's happy, local authorities aren't happy, the school system's not happy, the parents and carers aren't happy, so nobody's winning in this process, and the tribunal system is just a kind of final manifestation of that, I think.
System reform. Bring Sarah in.
Thank you, Chair. I think building on that, the most common issue that we hear, obviously, from parents and parent carers, and I think across the system, is that we need to find ways to remove the adversarial nature that it's become. And so my question really is, what we hear from parents and parent carers is that they feel that they are knocking on all of these different doors. They've got to try and get the funding from education, or is it from the local authority, or what about the role of health? And we haven't even heard much today, actually, about, how we find our ICBs operating within the realm of what's needed. So the question really is, how can we change that dynamic? Like, what solutions could there be in the future to how we could have a system where we can change that, and we can get shared agreement around how these budgets and this funding is agreed? What would we think ambitiously about how we could try and tackle this?
I think it does come back to fundamentally about the amount of resource you have in each of the sectors and capacity to deliver their respective roles. It's interesting through the tribunal system, I think I cited before, they obviously can make orders in terms of educational needs, special educational provision, but they can only make non-binding recommendations to health and social care. We didn't have. There needs to be teeth in those two areas too. At the moment, it comes back to schools and education and local authorities. We also have some concerns about that as well, because not all families have the resource understanding how to navigate that system either. So it will exacerbate disadvantage within that sitting too, and we need to be better at that. But fundamentally, unless we can be sure that each of the sectors who are involved in this have enough of the resource and sufficient resource to be able to deliver their duties and then be held accountable for that, then we're setting ourselves up to have this perpetually going around circles as we are at the moment, and then you do get that kind of terrible adversarial, as you say, situation and relationship. And because the children are within schools, that interface often happens at school, because they're the ones the parents meet with all the time.
Yeah, I just think that is the key to it. Parents, I've met groups of parents that are clearly working very hard for their parents, are very concerned, very, very worried, and really kind of battled. And they're doing the very best for their parents. But if we had a system whereby the mainstream school was better supported, so that they had trust in the local authority that they could provide that support in their mainstream schools. So they had educational psychologists there, they had speech and language specialists there, they had people in that school that could provide that for their children in their mainstream school with a broad curriculum and with their peers. Then the need for EHCPs might start to disappear. It's not to get rid of them, and we could never take away the parental right to go to tribunal. And of course, not all children will thrive in mainstream schools, but we need to provide that first. That needs some early intervention first to get that in place. Then parents, I think, will start to say, well, okay, my child will thrive, they will do well in this mainstream school, their local school. And I know that's a bit of a longer term aim, but this is where we come up. It's got to be system reform. It's fixing the funding and giving more money into it. It's fine, and clearly that needs to be done in the shorter term, and probably needs to be increased longer term. But if you don't parallel that with system reform, it's not going to work, and this isn't going to go away.
I'm going to move us on now to Darren.
Just recognising that the ISA have acknowledged there is some scepticism around accountability within independent SEND provision, particularly around sort of lacking adequate scrutiny and being held to different frameworks and so on. And Claire, Dorer, we'll start with you if that's okay. What's your response to that, and how do we go about improving that accountability in your view?
We need to drill down into what the concern actually is. Certainly across our membership, 95% are inspected by Ofsted, so the same as academies who are also independent schools, using the same framework, inspecting to the same independent school standards. On top of that, when local authorities place a child, most of them do quite stringent contract monitoring on a regular basis, where if there are concerns, they would raise them at the time. I would say often more effort goes into the contract monitoring than actually attending the EHCP reviews and finding out how the placement's working for the child. So it's difficult to understand what the area of accountability is that local authorities feel is lacking as a starting point. I think if I knew that, I might be able to respond differently, but they are certainly not under-regulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is around things like whether they're held to the same code of conduct, different obligations, the code of practice and things like that. So there's some things where they are held, whether they're doing them or not, and that might be part of it. It's just knowing that actually they are following them, even if they're perhaps not required to. But maybe that's the sort of issue I was getting at. Do you think they ought to be required to follow the same if you believe that the standard is
follow
the
the
same?
same code of conduct. So I'm not certain what bits the assumption is that they are not following or not part of the statutory framework within.
I mean, it's been partly raised, but I realise we're short of time for what the ISA said. Final question from me really is around that accountability and recognising we've said about value for money, and some of that might be perception, but how do we ensure that there is value for money with the public purse, and not just on cost but on quality, and that question is really a Councillor Foale and perhaps Phil Haslett, if you've got brief comments on how we do better at holding independent provision accountable in that space.
I mean, we already work quite closely with our independent sector. We've got a specialist commissioning team that support. A lot of our work, as probably Claire has alluded to, does tend to be a kind of contract monitoring level. So we'll have a commissioning agreement with a particular either school or group of schools, and we will look at the kind of arrangements for all of the children there. I do think the system at the moment, in terms of the actual code of practice and the ability to deliver annual reviews and be in there at a child level, is really challenging. But that isn't different in the independent sector as it is actually anywhere in the system. The vast increase in demand for education and health care plans means that the kind of need to operate the actual process itself, the annual review process, and be really in kind of working at a child level around the outcomes for individual children is really challenging across the system. So I don't think that's different in the independent sector as it is in as it is anywhere else. I think there is probably a lot of local variation in the way in which authorities work with the independent sector, and there's definitely a space. And we talked about regional networks and kind of there's a commissioning agreements. There's definitely a space for local authorities working better together with the independent sector around the kind of accountability outcomes for children and young people. But like I say, I don't think it's different. I wouldn't have it as different in the independent sector as anywhere else. There is a higher cost to the independent sector, but then we've already touched on that. And I don't, in terms of value for money, I wouldn't make a subjective view about it. I don't think, other than that they are providing more in the independent sector than we would necessarily provide in the state sector. Hence some of the increased cost.
Just in terms of when I asked this question of kind of a senior officer at Nottinghamshire, he just said that the Ofsted inspection regime is different for independent schools from state schools, and actually that some parity there would be quite helpful. Again, I think we've not touched on the Ofsted inspection regime, have we really? But I think again that's something that actually needs to be looked at. If you're going to kind of change accountability, you're going to change the way that we do things, you're going to have system reform. You need to have an Ofsted inspection framework that values things like inclusivity and all the kind of things that we've been talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Final question from Mark.
Brilliant, thank you. This is a very brief one. You don't have to say anything that you've not already said. Are there any final suggestions or changes that you recommend we make to the way SEND is funded to improve the system?
Obviously, the funding formulas and equity is a key message from us. But I think the challenge we've had over the last few years is that funding reform and policy has been detached from SEND policy. We've had SEND and AP change programme, the Green Paper, etc., following one pathway. We've had DBV, safety valve, which we've talked about, all these things, following a different path. We really need to make sure, moving forward, we've got an aligned funding reform alongside the actual the SEND reforms themselves. There's been a detachment from them. We've been involved in, as a local authority, in both, and they have felt detached. They are now starting to, they feel like they're coming back together, and that is around investing back in our mainstream system and into the early years sector. If we can invest in early years and we can invest in our mainstream system, we will start to see the benefits of that. It will take time, but we will see the benefits. And we are in a position now where we've got probably twice the number of kids out of mainstream school that we had 5 or 6 years ago, whether it's into specialist education, alternative provision, education other than at school, elective home education. There are too many children not accessing our mainstream system, so we need to invest in that and make sure we're really clear about what we want from our mainstream education system, not just leave them hanging out to say you need to be more inclusive. We need to really invest in them.
Should we go down the table?
Yes, sure. I would agree with what Phil said. I think it's important to reflect on just how much the system has changed in terms of how you deliver a better system. We've moved from a system where there are 2.8% of children eligible with statements of special educational needs, same every year, to one where there is now at least 5% of pupils with EHCPs, and increasing year on year. That almost by definition becomes a system where you have to provide more mainstream support, because it is more mainstream almost by numerical definition. And we haven't really had a conversation nationally about how best to support children, or policymakers deciding what are the thresholds, how do we support children in different areas. Well, it's been piecemeal response to every single EHCP in terms of providing, we have to legally provide that for that child, without having any sense about how we provide nationally. So, for example, we've seen, I said, 2.8 to over 5%, near doubling the number of pupils with autism. We've had a £4 billion increase in high needs funding over the last 6 years. We never had a conversation about how we could spend that £4 billion well across the whole system to provide good state support across the entire system. It was responsive to each and every child, and it never made sense collectively.
Thank you. Claire?
I'd like to see radical reform of mainstream education. I think we are still using teaching methods largely from Victorian times with 21st century children who we are now far more aware of impact of trauma on brains. We are now far more aware of a neurodiverse population. I don't think we've got a mainstream system that fits, and I think that's part of why we keep othering ever larger groups of children and young people. And alongside that, I'd like us to make much better use of our special schools strategically, to share and develop pedagogy that's going to help that process.
Very helpful, thank you. Rob?
Yes, I think looking more widely than just the funding, so looking at how curriculum, how assessment, how accountability, performance measures within schools and all those sorts of things incentivises the kind of inclusion we're seeking, and also understanding where investment, yes, of course we want more in funding within schools, but also in the wider workforce and the other than education areas, because they will provide part of the solution for being a more inclusive system, including within mainstream settings. All the conversations we have with specialist staff will tell us that they see themselves as part of that solution. So thinking around education psychologists, speech and language therapists and those sorts of areas too. If they're not part of the strategy, it doesn't matter how much money you put into the school system, when they turn for that specialist help and it's not there, it's not going to work. So that's be my recommendation. Thank you.
Exactly, thank you.
Finally, just quickly. Yeah, I think we just need to remember here as well that the outcomes for our children with SCND are poor. They've flatlined and they're not getting any better. I think we need to keep that at the centre of kind of all the conversations we have. We're not doing right by our children with SCND, and that for me is promoting and kind of supporting and putting more money into inclusive schools, early years, and preparing our young people for adult life. A lot of which is set out in the report.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much. Can I thank all of our witnesses for coming today to give us your evidence in such detail. It's been really valuable for our inquiry, and can I thank members for their time and their questions as well. Order. That brings us to the end of our proceedings for today.